Okay, today we're going to talk about reality. And first we're going to start by talking the reality of your homework, which I've now graded. But this is a quote from Albert Einstein, says, reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent illusion. We'll come back to that in class. I'm going to talk about homework number one. I've graded everybody's homework number one already. I read everything that everybody wrote, which was quite a bit, actually. So thank you. I love the models. I'm going to comment on them a little bit here. And then I'm going to jump into reality. We'll talk about augmented reality, virtual reality, and real. We probably won't get to occurrences, just because we started a little bit late today. But basically, after this class, we're going to be going through layer 1, then layer 2 and layer 3. Layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. For vision, then for hearing, and then for the other senses. So that'll be the next few weeks. We'll be focusing on layer 1 through layer 3. And today we're going to jump right in at layer 6. I have graded all of them, so you can see your grades on Moodle. Most of the class did very well, so I would say that's like 50% got a 90 or above. So if you're in not 90 or above, that doesn't mean you did bad, it just means you didn't do 90 or above. So if you didn't do 90 or above, then here are some of the things that you can ask yourself. One, did you read the modeling article and review the class slides and presentations? So if you didn't read the article and review the class slides and presentations, then that might be an explanation. Another one is, did you use Piazza or office hours to clarify any doubts about what you read or reviewed? The third one is, if you did read everything carefully and you reviewed, then I think you should come to the office hours, and I can hopefully help you get through this. We don't have a lot of homeworks in the class. There's only 7 of them plus the project. And so it's important that to do well on the exams that you understand the homeworks. Even if you didn't do well on the homeworks, now's a good opportunity to come back and try to understand why while it's still fresh in your minds. So that when it comes to the exam, you at least have a good shot of getting it. The exam will include modeling, and it's going to include the HSI model as well. So my intent here is not to surprise you on the exams. You will get new questions. They won't be the same questions as last year. They won't be the same questions on the homework. But if you did the homework and understood it well and understood the class, then you should do well on the exams. My office hours are intentionally on Tuesdays and Wednesdays because I know some people have the same schedules, Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday. They're also very early, 8:08 a.m. to 9:09 a.m. in Rectoria. If you just didn't put effort into it, then that would be an explanation. So that's the bottom. So some general observations. Again, most of you did very well, but where I did see some mistakes seemed to be that maybe the question wasn't either understood or wasn't read well, or the question that was asked wasn't exactly the question that was answered. And that's a little disappointing sometimes for all of us, because if I can see you put a lot of effort into something, but you didn't really answer the question, then it's hard for me to measure your knowledge, basically. Specifically, in terms of question number 1B, some of the explanations didn't refer to the model. So that one was one specifically where whatever it is that you had chosen, you would be talking about the layers of the model. Some of you didn't do that. In terms of question number 2, the main point of question number 2 was for you to recognize that you're generally observing things from the outside when it comes to deciding if someone else has consciousness other than your own. There were some very insightful responses related to computing systems where in a computing system you're not necessarily as constrained at looking from the outside. So there may be some things, if we get to the point where computing systems have consciousness, that we may be able to analyze about what they're doing inside that would be hard to do for a human being. So some of you picked up on that. But the main part of that was if you acknowledged or discussed that your perspective would be from the outside, and that was basically what I was looking for there. Question number 3, for the most part, most of you picked a professor. Some of you told me who it was, which I forgot to tell you. You didn't have to say that. There was everything was kind, so no one was harsh on a professor they named. But some of you didn't name a professor or thought, and so your model really wasn't about a professor, it was sort of more general. So that's, again, one of those where if it says choose a professor, then if you don't choose a professor, then you're already starting off not going to be able to get full credit for that. Some of the models were very straightforward, but very powerful in terms of what they captured. Others were very detailed and seemingly complex, but well explained. I would say for the most part, pretty much everybody, if not everybody, explained their model well. So whatever it is that they had there, when I read it, for the most part, I could understand. What I was looking for with the labels was so that when I saw the model, I should have some idea of what the model is. Based on whatever's there and whatever the arrows are, that should give me some idea. And with the labels, and then when I read it, I should definitely understand what it is. For the most part, that was the case. There was only maybe a couple of exceptions where that wasn't. Overall, I was very, very impressed with the quality and diversity of the models. There were no 2 models that were alike. There were definitely models like no model I've ever seen before, which was nice to see some of those. There were fascinating uses of SpongeBob, no names, but those, and that wasn't the only one. There were others that were just very creative in terms of how they combined things. The main thing in the modeling was to grasp the target of your model. If you read the article, the target is, what's the subject of your model, which in this case was the professor. And then as I described, it was to have the model so that when you look at the model, it's describing how they think, feel, and behave. Some of the models had how the professor thinks and behaves, but forgot about how they feel. Others of the models had characteristics, but they didn't really tie them together into a flow of how the professor was thinking or behaving. And that's one of the things I talked about in class, which is the action of it. So if you had some of those things, you got credit, but in order to get full credit, you need to have all of those things. Any questions about the modeling? Homework number 1. Otherwise, I'm going to move on with the caveat that if you aren't happy with your score and can't figure out the reason why, then I would suggest you come to my office hours, which I'll be at tomorrow morning and on Wednesday morning. Questions on the homework or comments?
will we see the other models like way or something?
I do have in mind to show some of the other models. I did that last year without showing who they're from. Last year was a little different because last year's models were about the person, and this year's model is about someone else. So I do plan to do that. I'm not exactly sure when I will do that, just because I lost 3 classes this semester. So I'm right now just trying to figure out how to make sure that you get the material that you need when you need it. More than likely, I would do it sometime before the exam, more than likely. Any other questions? So the HSI model is going to be a reference frame for us as we go through the semester. I mentioned that we would be, after today's class, spending a lot of time in going through layer 1 through layer 3 for lots of different types of instances. Today we're going to start with the reality, and we're going to talk about augmented reality, virtual reality, and real reality. And remember, as we go through layers 1, 2, and 3, we're going to be looking at human beings, and we're going to be looking at artificial computing systems. So we'll always have that analog of this is how humans capture photons and create images, and this is how computers capture photons and create them. This is how computers capture vibrations in the air, and this is how human beings capture vibration in the air and make sound, interpret sound. Next couple of slides are pretty straightforward. I think that most of you have probably either played games or used some of this stuff before. But it's important because of how the artificial reality folds into human realities. Augmented reality is just simply an overlay of some additional information that's overlaid on top of whatever the other information is that's in the reality that you're observing. So that's an example there. And then virtual reality is different than augmented reality. And here's a definition here, where if you do it right, the user accepts the reality that the electronics are providing them over the reality that's there. Normally that's done with sights and sound. It's not limited to sights and sound. Some of you may have gone to amusement parks where you have, where you're moving and you've got, some either screen in front of you or some goggles on, and you're hearing things, and then there are things being squirted at you, and then there's smells, so you can go pretty far. I struggle with virtual reality actually, in that if it gets too real for me, sometimes I can get a little queasy, and that's an idea where the concepts that you're creating in your mind as to the reality you're seeing somehow aren't matching up with what parts of your body are predicting. And so sometimes you can feel a little disoriented in virtual reality. I'd like to get some feedback now in terms of your observations of virtual reality.
It's pretty cool. And it's like become pretty like it's the past 5 years it has gone far with different types of actual. You can have a virtual headset in your house and you don't have to. It's still pretty expensive, but it's manageable. Like, when I was a kid, seeing that, I wouldn't think it's possible to have that in my house.
Actually, was really impressed by it.
I went to this thing called The Void.
The Void?
The Void, and it works that you get this gear, this virtual reality headset, and it takes place in this huge room, almost like a labyrinth. But with the gear on, it's like you're actually there. I guess you can walk around, and you can actually feel. Like, you can see glass, touch it, you can feel the glass, and in reality, it's just a mirror. But it's there so that because it's intended, when you touch it, you can actually feel it. And the one I went, it was themed after Star Wars, and it was, in my opinion, it was really realistic. Not just because what you can see, but because what you feel and you listen. So I think that's pretty.
Has anybody seen Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.?
Yes.
Do you remember Ada? And the virtual world? Is it Mac? Do you remember Mac?
Yeah.
Mac had to make a decision because his daughter didn't exist in the real world. He had to decide if he was going to stay in the imaginary world, which he knew was imaginary. But he could touch his daughter there, he could speak with his daughter there. Or if he was going to go back to the real world. And he struggled with that decision. Why did he struggle with that decision?
He told that she was real. He lost her. She was back technically. They wanted to be with her.
So even though he knew it wasn't real, he could see her, he could touch her, he could smell her, he could hug her. She would interact with him similarly to how she interacted with him before. And so it, raised this question of, well, if for all intents and purposes, it creates everything at layer 6, then what's the difference between reality and virtual reality at that point? So people have been thinking about virtual reality for a long time. I wasn't even born in 1965, so this is a really long time. This is one of what they consider to be one of the earliest virtual reality types of contraptions. And you can see it. I'll be on the slides, but you can look at this link online. And same kind of idea of having some, something manipulate what you're seeing. I would have shown you the video, but you can watch it later, just to gain a little bit of time here. As you can imagine, with my pointer here, this is a pretty significant piece of equipment that needed to go with this headset, and this headset was extremely heavy, so they had to be suspended to keep some of the weight off. So it's amazing in terms of how small we were talking about, the headset that you can put on, or maybe some goggles or glasses. But at the same time, it's interesting how similar this is to what we're doing now, where there's still this perception that you have to have something to sort of cover and mask the eyes. As you guys are successful in your career, I'm hoping some of you will work in these areas, and I'm sure you'll come up with interesting ways of improving the technology that's here. That's my favorite part of this slide. It's an anonymous in-class survey. When you pull it up, it's going to ask you for one sentence. To write one sentence about what is reality. So think about it for a little bit. Be philosophical, poetic. dry, humorous. Give a little more time to write. Take your time. Okay, so here we have some of an illusion of the things you want to happen, what we choose it to be, wherever you believe you exist, elusive conviction. experiences an individual has. It's the way that you see, feel, and think things are. What your senses feed and your brain accepts as true. Reality is our own. Anything that someone strongly believes in is that person's reality. A labyrinth of pain and happiness. It's what an individual perceives and sees on a day-to-day basis. That's a little bit longer than figure effectively something. Reality is subjective, cannot determine a reality for everyone. Anything that you can experience with your senses, an interpretation of what your body can sense, which is perceived as a simulation. What me, myself, and I feel. Reality is what a person can interact with and see in a regular day-to-day life. Reality is what we experience. General perception of existence. Something each individual constructs through their perception of the world. Reality is the perspective of our mind. Reality is the perspective our mind creates after receiving all the necessary information of our surrounding through our five senses. Our reality is the shadow cast by the light in the allegory of the cave. Existence in disguise. Very good. Well, you can see all those were the same. I was being sarcastic. They're all different. Very different, actually. Very good. Thank you for doing that. Here are what some other people wrote. Albert Einstein said, reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. William Shakespeare wrote, all that glitters is not gold. John Lennon wrote, reality leaves a lot to the imagination. And Pablo Picasso wrote, everything you can imagine is real. I thought I'd find one in Spanish. So I found this one. Dictionary says it's an event, an entity, or a state of affairs. Having an objective, independent existence. So what this is that reality exists independent of us, or independent of observation. So do they have this in Spanish where they say if a tree falls in the forest, did it make a sound? You ever heard that? No. What do they say in Spanish? So this gets us into one of my favorite scientific principles, which is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which relates to reality and an observer of reality. So in this case, we're going to apply in the context of if there is a reality, can you observe the reality without altering the reality? So if we go back to that definition, it said, things that are real exist independently of observation, occur independently of observation, and are as they are independently of observation. So observation breaks strict reality because you're converting whatever is happening into something else. That's basically the idea. So at the top I put here, can you know how fast something moves at the same time you know exactly where it is? See you shaking head. Can somebody, if you believe you cannot, can you, someone explain please why that?
Well, that's the certain because, but that's only according to the life that is part of my heart. So, either where it is, where you know how fast it is, or where you know how fast it is.
Yeah, so that's right from a quantum
Yeah.
physics perspective. From a layperson's perspective, which is just means you and me, if a car is moving down the road, you know exactly where that car is. You can't know how fast it's going, because to know how fast something's going, you need to know the change in position over time. So if you know at some point in time, right now, where something is, you need to know, in order to calculate how fast it's moving, you need some amount of displacement in position over time. And so if you now have some amount of displacement, then you don't know exactly where it is. That's basically the non-quantum mechanics version of it. So if you're looking at something like one of the stars on Orion's belt, you can't know exactly where it is and how fast it's moving. Something else you can't know, which is whether or not it exists. I saw a news story on CNN a couple of years ago where they were talking about something that had just happened. Some star had just gone supernova, without realizing that that didn't just happen, because it takes a long time for light to get from that far away to us. So when you look up at the stars, you're really looking at past versus what's actually happening now. So that's something we don't think about very often. But when we think about those types of delays in sound, or those types of delays in light even, it says that the reality that we're seeing now is some sort of combination of things that are happening always over time. It always takes time for you to observe what's happening in reality. Which of the top or the bottom of the table is longer? The table on the left. Who thinks the top is longer than the bottom?
What do you mean the top is longer than the bottom?
Like the top of the table, top of the screen, versus the part of the table that's at the bottom of the screen. And then we can go to the table on the right. So this bottom part here, or this top part, which one's longer? Or do you think they're the same, or do you think they,
The top
looks longer?
slightly longer.
Let's see if it's a trick. Exit from there so I can check. The server. So it's the same. But it wasn't really a trick. The real reality is that they're exactly the same. That's the real reality. But your mind at layer 6 is creating a reality that your consciousness is observing that's different than the real reality. I think, have I talked about the McGurk effect in this class? I know it was in the article I wrote. I'm gonna put up the video. Basically, this is one where you see and hear things at the same time, and then what you hear is a function of what you see. So, I'll put it up here just in case someone hasn't seen it, although I don't have my speaker handy. So basically what you want to do is look at this side. If you're over on this side of the room, then just look at her. And if you're over on this side of the room, then you can look at her. And if you're in the middle, then you can just decide which one. Let's see.
R, 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 R.
Who looked at both sides? So what happened when you looked at both sides?
When you look at the left, it looks like she's saying car. Right, she's saying car.
So at least for me, and I'm guessing it was similar for you, I'm convinced I'm hearing something different. In my head, I'm hearing something different. Does that help us for you? So again, another example of where the simulated reality that's occurring and the actual reality here is that there's only one sound. How can you tell what she's really saying? All right, so let's close our eyes and see.
R, 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 R.
Did you hear? Huh? You do? That could be some sort of, that could be some sort of imprinting. That's in you, that's in you. Yeah. Interesting. I'm not about to tell you what the right answer is, because I would just have another vote on my perception of what reality is. But I do this because in our day-to-day, where most of what happens is consistent with our observation of it, or so we think. When it has to do with things like doors, for the most part, our perception of that door is consistent with the reality. But I have a screen door in my house, not a glass door. And about a month ago, I heard this, there was a little kid who had like run, and his perception was that there was nothing there, and the reality is there was a screen there. So he had a different perception of reality. It was a screen. So he didn't run there, and his mind was telling him there's a screen, and I'm going to go through that screen. Right? In his mind, he didn't. It wasn't that he didn't see the screen. I think it's a better way to say it is what he saw was that there was no screen. And at first, that may sound like a weird thing, but when you go through these types of fairly simple, straightforward things where you can understand them, what I'm trying to do is get to the point where you understand that that your subconscious processes are so powerful that even if you know, it could not matter. You will still hear, you will still see. Where this gets to be more important is it's one thing to say, okay, my concepts are working in such a way that I can hear someone say something that they're not saying, or I can hear someone say something depending on what version of the video I look at.
It's like
And
a blue dress and a blue and black.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that.
That changes color. I mean, did it
you mean the
change
black
colors?
thing?
It was blue and black. And people saw it white and gold.
So this is important for a couple of different reasons. First, let me talk about the engineering reason. The engineering reason is when you get to work on things like virtual reality, you realize that your objective is really to manipulate the simulated reality. So if I can manipulate your simulated reality, not the actual reality, but just your simulated reality, then I can effectively create an environment theoretically that's as real as the environment that is real. Right? And that's why you can be in some simulated technology scenarios where you will react, where you will duck, even though you know that you're just sitting somewhere. So that's the objective from a computing standpoint, is to understand how people view reality through the simulations of reality and manipulators. The second part of it is to remember to take a step back as you're trying to interpret what's going on in the world, because if you think looking at a door and deciding if there's a screen or not, or if there is a door or not, or she's saying bar or far, imagine back in this complex scenario where you're interacting with another human being and there's a lot of things going on and you're trying to decide what that person said. If I tell you now that there might be some cases where someone said, you thought someone said something and they didn't really actually said that, but you're playing it back in your mind and you know that they said that, sometimes you may want to think back to this example and say, well, look, maybe they didn't really say that. Maybe I just thought they were going to say that, and I was so convinced they were going to say that, and I'm so angry that that's what I heard. So is that possible? So this effect is named after that psychologist. Oops. So this is Michael Abrash or Abrash, who's I'm not sure if he still is, but he was at least at one point the chief scientist at Oculus. I'll just let you read that. Well, we actually got that through that pretty quick. I don't know if it's because I think you know this already, or I think we talked about it a little bit before already, but we have time to talk about this some more. Yes.
Sometimes when I'm about to fall asleep, I would unconscious, about to fall asleep, and I dream of something and jump in my bed. I don't know, does that have to do with the simulated reality? That's not really me thinking, it's just my brain sort of half awake, half asleep.
So
Is there
there,
an explanation for that based on?
yeah. Well, I can give you a thought based on the model. So presumably, what's happening when you're looking at the lady who's speaking and you're trying to decide if it's bar or if it's far, is that your subconscious is making a prediction as to what it is, but not a prediction and then telling you the word, but a prediction and creating a voice in your head that hears that. So it's a probability. When you are, and there's a couple different aspects of what you described. One is where you jump. Another is when you're kind of half asleep and half awake. And let me talk about the latter first before I talk about the former. When you're half asleep and half awake, you are accessing information about the real world, which the real world being what's coming in through your five senses. Plus, when you're asleep, there's a strong focus on what is being generated inside your head. I call it a strong focus. It's not exclusive because there is some part of your subconsciousness which is sort of always high alert to let you know if you should wake up. So even though you're sleeping, if the alarm goes off, there's a good chance you'll hear and you'll wake up. Your subconscious is processing all that information that's coming in through those layers and making a prediction, right, to create this reality. And then when you're in your half state, basically, you can imagine that those predictions may not be completely accurate because they're based on information that's coming from both inside your head and information that's coming from the outside. You can do some of this. You can test this in different environments. For example, if you knew that you had just seen a spider, and then the spider sort of ran away, or whatever those spiders do when they move fast, you would, and then you felt something on your neck, right? Your first reaction might be that there's a spider. If you hadn't seen that spider, your first reaction might be something different. So if you are laying down at night and you've got something that's crawling on you, what's your first reaction going to be? Okay? I don't know because I don't know the context of it. Right? If you grew up in an environment where you had a little brother or sister that constantly came in the room and tickled your neck at night, then you might actually think your brother was there. And then wake up and realize that your brother doesn't even live with you anymore. So it's hard to say. So probabilities basically that your subconscious is applying to create that reality very fast. And that's why, if you forget everything about this class years from now, and you remember just one thing, remember that time is your secret weapon. So when you're not sure what's happening, in most situations, you have some time to gain more information, to let your subconscious give you other probabilities. That might be consistent, better predictors of the reality that's happening. Any other comments, questions, or dialogue? Thank you for that. That was a good way to talk about some other things related to reality. Yes.
So I was just thinking about what you said on timing as well. Because it gives you time to rethink some of those predictions. Because I just realized that I used to read Twitter a lot, so I read out of tweets during the week. So I noticed that recently my subconscious predicts what some of the tweets say. And when I scroll back to those tweets, I realized that it said something completely different from what I thought. So reminding that I didn't have the time to react to that and make another prediction and realize what it actually said. I wouldn't be able to make any good decisions.
And if we're environments where we're biased one way or the other, if we're talking to someone that we don't like, we don't really hear what they say, right? So now we've got to decide if they said far or far. What's the probability that we might be skewed to hear or believe they said something that was negative versus something that was very, very positive? To me, this is really scary. And I think it goes back to our very first class where we talked about, some of the problems that are going on in the world and what can we do in this class to help solve some of those problems. Okay, well, I think we actually can get a little bit into occurrences. One more comment, I've said this before, but remember the problem or the limitation of conscious thought is it's limited and it's slow. So whereas your subconscious can handle hundreds, maybe even thousands of very complex things that are happening all at the same time, and feed you information that it thinks, summarize information to your consciousness that it thinks is representative of what you should know. Your conscious can only deal with a certain amount of information. So we are here, and we just talked about our view, our conscious view of what's being presented. But the reality is down here. And the reality we get to observe through the modifications it makes to the things that we physically interact with in some way. And so we're going to talk now about what those things are, those occurrences. Occurrences just comes from occur, which means that something happens, something that's happening or occurring. You can describe occurrences in different ways. I'm going to describe them here in 6 different ways. 3 of which tend to do things that we can observe right away, and 3 of which don't. So the first type of occurrence I'm going to describe is called a direct occurrence. And as most occurrences, this is something that actually happens and that you can touch, hear, see, taste, smell in the moment. And so it influences your perspective potentially immediately. So if it were to rain, you could see it or feel it. Or if you were to lose power, If I were to raise my hand and you were looking, that would be a direct occurrence. So right now there's a lot of direct occurrences that air conditioning is making a sound. Who here knew I was going to say that? Or who here was focusing on the air conditioning sound before I said it? Can you hear it now? Is it really loud? So those are occurrences. Then there are internal occurrences. Again, these are things that happen, but these involve thoughts, feelings, emotions that may also influence your perspective, but they are internal to you. So the idea is I can't know your thoughts right now anyway. I can't feel what you're feeling. I can't experience your emotions. I may be able to infer, maybe, based on something that you're doing or saying, if what you're doing or saying is reflective of something that you're feeling that subjectively is somewhat similar to an experience I've felt. So there's a lot of ifs in there. So for the most part, I don't know what you're feeling. I don't know what you're thinking. And that's because those types of occurrences are occurrences that are internal to you. This kind of relates to the problem, one of the homework problems, where it was said basically if you created something that had consciousness, would you be able to prove it? Then there are derived occurrences. Again, these are things that happen, but you're informed of them through your senses, but you didn't directly observe it. Now, you could just say that that these occurrences really don't affect you at a given time, and that's true. So we could leave this one out and just say, well, it's either direct and it's outside of a person, or it's internal and it's inside of a person. The reason we add this here is because it actually did happen at that time. It just happened and you weren't directly aware of it. So it's related to a change in reality. If we take the example of the stars, whether or not one of the stars in Orion disappeared, we wouldn't know that when it happened. It would have been an occurrence at some point in time in the past. When we heard about it, we would be being informed of something that already happened. So that would be a derived occurrence. So I've talked about those in terms of human beings, but those are also true in terms of artificial beings. So if we're building a robot that we want to exist in the real world and have some amount of free will, then that robot needs to have some information about the occurrences that are within the environment that it's in that can affect it directly. It also needs to know what's going on inside of the robot, internal to the robot. And then it has to have some concept, presumably, of time. So that it understands that the things that it does now have implications on what the future looks like, as well as the things that already occurred somewhere else maybe can have an impact on what the future will be. Now we're going to talk very briefly about 3 other types of occurrences that we're not really going to focus on in class. One is called being occurrences, which is something that happens to you as a physical human being, but you're not aware of it. And it's not sensed, and it doesn't influence your perspective. These are things that are internal, but you don't know they're going on.
Mosquito bite would be a pain.
Mosquito bite, because it occurred from the outside, it would be something that actually happened. You got bit by the mosquito. If you weren't aware of it happening, then your awareness of that would be whenever you felt it. So that would be derived. And then basically this is the opposite, looking at it, something that's happening inside of someone else. And then remote. Most things that happen are remote. You don't know they happen, you'll never know they happen. When you know it happened, to the extent you can really know anything happened, then it would become derived. Again, we're not really worried too much about remote or being or inside someone else. We're mostly focused on things that either directly affect us are going up, directly affect us and are happening outside of us, or directly affect us that are happening inside of us, or things that happen that then come and affect us. Yeah.
In the last, you are in period of strong senses. So the something can be, even though it is near you, can be sense as remote. Because it's far away enough for you that the other senses don't sense it, but the one that visual, I'm blind and can't see it.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's fair. These are not necessarily hard lines. There'll be some words.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to share this video for 3 minutes and then we'll be done.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have work to do. Thank you. You were tested by unimaginable tragedy. Your compassion and your leadership over the past month has been an inspiration to Connecticut and to me personally. It will not surprise anyone here tonight or today that this speech is very different from the one that I first envisioned giving. In the early days of December, I began thinking about what I'd like to say today. Now, while it's only been a few short weeks on the calendar, we have all walked a very long and very dark road together. What befell Newtown is not something that we thought possible in any Connecticut beautiful small town or our cities. And yet, in the midst of one of the worst days in our history, we also saw the best of our state. Teachers and a therapist that sacrificed their lives protecting students. A principal and school psychologist that ran into harm's way. Our brave Connecticut state troopers, Newtown's local law enforcement and firemen, and others that responded courageously when called upon. Sorry. In the aftermath, a select woman, a superintendent, and other local officials have served around the clock, bringing comfort and stability to Newtown. And today, Sandy Hook's teachers are doing what they do best, putting the interest of their students first as they return to classrooms, and providing stability and continuity that has never been so important and so needed as it is today. And then, of course, there are the 26 families. The families that, despite unimaginable loss, have gotten up each and every day since that happened, and have been there for one another and have supported their communities as much as those communities have supported them. They have persevered, and in that perseverance, we should all find strength. We have lifted one another up and continued carrying up the spirit of our fallen heroes and our wounded families and our beautiful lost children. As a state and as a community, we will continue to do whatever we can for the families of Newtown. But we must also ask ourselves, what is our responsibility? To those we've lost, to one another, to the children, and to future generations. During this legislative session, we're going to begin to answer those questions together. Let us do everything in our power to ensure that Connecticut never again suffers a loss such as this.
Did anybody feel anything when they heard or saw those speeches? Huh? That's the opening quote of the book. So I wanted you to actually see that's what you're. It's a very sad history, if you will. I would like you to read chapter 1. And I showed that because I wanted to have you really understand chapter 1. So when she's describing the speech, this is the speech that she's talking about. Thanks.